Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome back to Voices of Empowerment with Dr. B. I am Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee. I am an LPC. I am also a licensed marriage and family therapist. I am also a spiritual teacher, mentor, leader, astrologer, all of the things. And I am here to journey with you through this amazing, amazing, amazing book. It's called Caste. I never heard of the story of the book Caste, but I saw the movie Origins. Origins is the book that derived from this is the movie that derived from this book. And when I tell you, it is absolutely amazing. This movie really, really, really detailed our the genesis of the divide in this country. And man, oh man, oh man, it. I knew that it came from a book and written by Isabel Wilkerson. I knew that it came from it, but I wasn't sure which book it was. I didn't know the story at all. I was not familiar with the book at all. But when I tell you, this book here, it goes all the way to the very beginning of when the divide happened, which obviously was during the takeover of the lands where the indigenous people um, were residing. And it is it's something serious. It really, really is. And where she picked up this book, which is where we read last time, she started off talking about the 2016 election and how it incited in the time that Trump was in office, it incited such a um it was like an audacity that came forth. And yeah, we've heard of discrimination, we've heard of bigotry, we've heard of racism, we've heard all of these things. We've heard it not just in our books. We've talked about it in schools. We've talked about it in our homes. We have some members of our family that can detail events that they lived through, things that their elders experience and whatnot, ancestors experience. But it's one thing to hear about it, and it's another thing to experience it yourself. And although today it doesn't quote unquote look like what our ancestors experienced, but it's just a modernized version. I was talking to my brother yesterday and I said, I really do feel like we're in today a modernized Jim Crow. We didn't experience the Jim Crow back then, but we're experiencing this day's version of it. And shockingly enough, shockingly, but unshockingly, disappointingly, I'll say, the issues are still here. And you never know how to fix a thing until you identify the origins of it. And so far, Isabel Wilkerson is doing a beautiful job in pinpointing the origins of our discontents. And I'm excited about it. I am excited about it. It's some truths are very hard to face. They are. But it doesn't mean that they don't need to be confronted, because they do. And this is how we do it as a unit, as a people. We have to face them. We have to confront them. As difficult, as uncomfortable, as horrifying, traumatizing as it is, we have to have these conversations. We must have these conversations. They are a necessity, because even the Bible says the people perish for the lack of knowledge. People perish for the lack of knowledge, because of the lack of knowledge. If you don't realize the power that you are, then you're susceptible to believe what someone else tells you that you are. If you don't know it for yourself, you'll be conditioned to believe anything. And so oftentimes, um, we act out of our ignorance and not knowing who we are and the power that we possess, and how individually we're powerful, but then collectively we're even more powerful. There's a reference, there's a line that is in the old school movie, Soul Food, where the mother, she sat at the table. They had this tradition of Sunday dinner, okay, which is often, traditional inside of especially the Black family. And she was saying, as far as discord within the family, she says, when we're separated and divided, we're weak, okay. But when we are collective, it's like a hand, when each one of us are individual fingers. But when those fingers come together, form a fist and packs a mighty punch. And it does. Look at the outcome of our unified boycott of Target. The result of the unified boycott of Target, post the pullback of the DEI. They were among the first to do it. Okay. I read an article a couple days ago, literally just 2 days ago, where the CEO of Target has had to take a 54% pay cut due to the billions of dollars that is no longer coming to Target as a result of us coming together and packing a mighty punch and letting them know, listen, we would love to share this planet with you, and it be fair, and we all come and enjoy one another and enjoy this place together as one. But what we will no longer take is you diminishing our place, our value, and what we bring. Okay, we're just as valuable as you. And that's the whole point of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not to say that every other life don't matter. No. If they were simply conveying that Black lives matter too, just as much as yours. That was the message. And they know that was the message. They just, and as we see today, where Trump is back in office, we see that there's an attack on minority across the board. Historical buildings and information and monuments are being torn down, erasing, so to speak, our history that can be accessed tangibly, I should say. But that's why it's imperative that we have these conversations, because they cannot erase our bloodline. They cannot erase our memories and knowledge and what we share amongst each other, especially from our ancestors to us. There are stories that my grandmother told me that I will never forget. That's how history, that's how stories remain alive. That's how you immortalize your bloodline. That's how you immortalize the heroes that came before you. This has been happening for centuries, where our history that's been written and recorded has been wiped away. That doesn't make it any less historical. You can burn a book, but you can't take my story. It is what it is. It doesn't make it any less true, because my story, our stories, are written, forever written in the fabrics and tapestry of this realm. You cannot ever erase it. You can tear down a building, sure, go right ahead, but you will not tear my story down. My story stands even when the monument doesn't. But in order for the story to stand tall within us all, we got to share, we got to talk. We cannot be afraid to do that, because that is perpetuating the slavery mentality, remaining quiet, because we don't want to get in trouble. Shh, don't talk about that, because Massa hear you. You get in trouble. You get us in trouble. Still in that slave mentality. Talk. Open your mouth. Open your mouth. Okay? So, with all that being said, we're going to go into the next chapter. The next chapters, we're going to be reading chapters 4 and 5 of Caste, the origins of our discontent. We are airing from several different platforms: Clubhouse, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, all over. Okay, so you all be sure to join in the conversation. If you have something you want to share to the collective, feel free to use the comment section. That's what it's there for, and I will give voice to your words. But if not, and you just want to hear me read, in an audible setting, then that's perfectly fine as well. Okay. Alrighty, here we go. This is Caste, the origins of our discontent. Part 2, the arbitrary construction of human divisions. Chapter 4, a long-running play and the emergence of caste in America. Day after day, the curtain rises on a stage of epic proportion, and that has been running for centuries. The actors wear the costumes of their predecessors and inhabit the roles assigned to them. The people in these roles are not the characters they play, but they have played the roles long enough to incorporate the roles into their very being, to merge the assignment with their inner selves and how they are seen in the world. The costumes were handed out at birth and can never be removed. The costumes cue everyone in the cast to the roles each character is to play and to each character's place on the stage. Over the run of the show, the cast has grown accustomed to who plays which part. For generations, everyone has known who is center stage and the lead. Everyone knows who the hero is, who the supporting characters are, who is the sidekick, go for laughs, and who is in shadow. The undifferentiated chorus with no lines to speak, no voice to sing, but necessary for the production to work. The roles become sufficiently embedded into the identity of the players that the leading man or woman would not be expected so much as to know the names or to take notice of the people in the back, and there would be no need for them to do so. Stay in the roles long enough, and everyone begins to believe that the roles are preordained, that each cast member is best suited by talent and temperament for their assigned role, and maybe for only that role that they belong there and were meant to be cast as they are currently seen. The cast members become associated with their characters, typecast, locked into either inflated or disfavored assumptions. They become their characters. As an actor, you are to move the way you are directed to move, speak the way your character is expected to speak. You are not yourself. You are not to be yourself. Stick to the script and to the part you are cast to play, and you will be rewarded. Veer from the script, and you will face the consequences. Veer from the script, and other cast members will step in to remind you where you went off script. Do it often enough or at a critical moment, and you may be fired, demoted, cast out, your character conveniently killed off in the plot. The social pyramid known as a caste system is not identical to the caste in the play, though the similarity in the two words hints at a tantalizing intersection. When we are cast into roles, we are not ourselves. We are not supposed to be ourselves. We are performing based on our place in the production, not necessarily on who we are inside. We are all players on the stage that was built long before our ancestors arrived in this land. We are the latest cast in a long-running drama that premiered on this soil in the early 17th century. It was in late August 1619, a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, that a Dutch man of war set anchor at the mouth of James River at Point Comfort in the wilderness of what is now known as Virginia. We know this only because of a haphazard line in a letter written by the early settler John Rolfe. This is the oldest surviving reference to Americas in the English colonies in America, people who look different from the colonists and who would ultimately be assigned by law to the bottom of an emerging caste system. Rolfe mentions them as merchandise and not necessarily the merchandise the English settlers had been expecting. The ship brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, Rolfe wrote, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. These Africans had been captured from a slave ship bound for the Spanish colonies, but were sold farther north to the British. Historians do not agree on what their status was, if they were bound in the short term for indentured servitude or relegated immediately to the status of lifetime enslavement, the condition that would befall most every human who looked like them arriving on these shores or born here for the next quarter millennium. The few surviving records from the time of their arrival show they held at the outset a singularly debased status in the eyes of white Virginians, wrote the historian Alden D. Vaughan. If not yet consigned formally to permanent enslavement, Black Virginians were at least well on their way to such a condition. In the decades to follow, colonial laws herded European workers and African workers into separate and unequal queues and set in motion the caste system that would become the cornerstone of the social, political, and economic system in America. This caste system would trigger the deadliest war on U.S. soil, lead to the ritual killings of thousands of subordinate caste people in lynching, and become the source of the inequalities that becloud and destabilize the country to this day. With the first rough attempts at a colonial census conducted in Virginia in 1630, a hierarchy began to form. Few Africans were seen as significant enough to be listed in the census by name, as would be the case for the generations to follow. In contrast to the majority of European inhabitants, indentured or not, the Africans were not cited by age or arrival date, as were the Europeans. Information vital to setting the terms and time frame of indenture for Europeans or for Africans, had they been in the same category, been seen as equal or seen as needing to be accurately accounted for. Thus, before there was a United States of America, there was a caste system, born in colonial Virginia. At first, religion, not race, as we not now know it, defined the status of people in the colonies. Christianity, as a proxy for Europeans, generally exempted European workers from lifetime enslavement. This initial distinction is what condemned first indigenous people and then Africans, most of whom were not Christian upon arrival, to the lowest rung of an emerging hierarchy before the concept of race had congealed to justify their eventual and total debasement. The creation of a caste system was a process of testing the bounds of human categories and not the result of a single edict. It was a decades-long sharpening of lines whenever the colonists had a decision to make. When Africans began converting to Christianity, they posed a challenge to a religion-based hierarchy. Their efforts to claim full participation in the colonies was in direct opposition to the European hunger for the cheapest, most pliant labor to extract the most wealth from the New World. The strength of African workers began their undoing. British colonists in the West Indies, for example, saw Africans as a civilized and relatively docile population who were accustomed to discipline and who cooperated well on a given task. Africans demonstrated an immunity to European diseases, making them more viable to the colonists than were the indigenous people the Europeans had originally tried to enslave. More pressingly, the colonies of the Chesapeake were faltering and needed manpower to cultivate tobacco. The colonies farther south were suited for sugarcane, rice, and cotton, crops with which the English had little experience, but that Africans had either cultivated in their native lands or were quick to master. The colonists soon realized that without Africans and the skills that they brought, their enterprises would fail, wrote the anthropologists Audrey and Brian Smedley. In the eyes of the European colonists and to the Africans' tragic disadvantage, they happened to bear an inadvertent birthmark over their entire bodies that should have been nothing more than a neutral variation in human appearance, but which made them stand out from the English and Irish indentured servants. The Europeans could and did escape from their masters and blend into the general white population that was hardening into a single caste. The Gallic insurrections caused the English to seek to replace this source of servile labor entirely with another source, African slaves, the Smedleys wrote. The colonists had been unable to enslave the native population on its own turf and believed themselves to have solved the labor problem with the Africans they imported. With little further use for the original inhabitants, the colonists began to exile them from their ancestral lands and from the emerging caste system. This left Africans firmly at the bottom, and by the late 1600s, Africans were not merely slaves. They were hostages subjected to unspeakable tortures that their captors documented without remorse, and there was no one on the planet willing to pay a ransom for their rescue. Americans are loath to talk about enslavement in part because what little we know about it goes against our perceptions of our country as a just and enlightened nation, a beacon of democracy for the world. Slavery is commonly dismissed as a sad, dark chapter in the country's history. It is as if the greater the distance we can create between slavery and ourselves, the better to stave off the guilt or shame it induces. But in the same way that individuals cannot move forward, become whole and healthy, unless they examine the domestic violence they witness as children or the alcoholism that runs in their family, the country cannot become whole until it confronts what was not in a chapter in its history, but the basis of its economic and social order. For a quarter millennium, slavery was the country. Slavery was a part of everyday life, a spectacle that public officials and European visitors to the slaving provinces could not help but comment on with curiosity and revulsion. In a speech in the House of Representatives, a 19th century congressman from Ohio lamented that on the beautiful avenue in front of the Capitol, members of Congress during this session have been compelled to turn aside from their path to permit a coffle of slaves, male and females, chained to each other by their necks to pass on their way to this national slave market. The Secretary of the U.S. Navy expressed horror at the sight of barefoot men and women locked together with the weight of an ox chain in the beating sun, forced to walk the distance to damnation in a state farther south, and riding behind them a white man on horseback, carrying pistols in his belt, and who, as we passed him, had the impudence to look us in the face without blushing. The Navy official James K. Paulding said, when they, the slaveholders, permit such flagrant and indecent outrages upon humanity as that I have described, when they sanction a villain in thus marching half-naked women and men loaded with chains without being charged with a crime, but that of being black, from one section of the United States to another, hundreds of miles in face of day, they disgrace themselves and the country to which they belong. Slavery in this land was not merely an unfortunate thing that happened to Black people. It was an American innovation, an American institution created by and for the benefit of the elites of the dominant caste and enforced by poorer members of the dominant caste who tied their lot to the caste system rather than to their consciences. It made lords of everyone in the dominant caste, as law and custom stated that submission is required of the slave, not to the will of the master only, but to the will of all other white persons. It was not merely a torn thread in an otherwise perfect cloth, wrote the sociologist Steven Steinberg. It could be closer to say that slavery provided the fabric out of which the cloth was made. American slavery, which lasted from 1619 to 1865, was not the slavery of ancient Greece or the illicit sex slavery of today. The aberrant slavery of today is unreservedly illegal, and any current day victim who escapes to a world that recognizes her freedom and will work to punish her enslaver. American slavery, by contrast, was legal and sanctioned by the state and a web of enforcers. Any victim who managed to escaped to a world that not only did not recognize her freedom, but would return her to her captors for further unspeakable horrors as retribution. In American slavery, the victims, not the enslavers, were punished, subject to whatever atrocities the enslaver could devise as a lesson to others. What the colonists created was an extreme form of slavery that had existed nowhere in the world, wrote the legal historian Ariel J. Gross. For the first time in history, one category of humanity was ruled out of the human race and into a separate subgroup that was to remain enslaved for generations in perpetuity. The institution of slavery was, for a quarter millennium, the conversion of human beings into currency, into machines who existed solely for the profit of their owners, to be worked as long as the owners desired, who had no rights over their bodies or loved ones, who could be mortgaged, bred, won in a bet, given as wedding presents, bequeathed to heirs, sold away from spouses or children to cover an owner's debt, or to spite a rival or to settle an estate. They were regularly whipped, raped, and branded, subjected to any whim or distemper of the people who owned them. Some were castrated or endured other tortures too grisly for these pages, tortures that the Geneva Conventions would have banned as war crimes had the conventions applied to people of African descent on this soil. Before there was a United States of America, there was enslavement. Theirs was a living death passed down for 12 generations. The slave is doomed to toil, that others may reap the fruits, is how a letter writer identifying himself as Judge Ruffin testified to what he saw in the Deep South. The slave is entirely subject to the will of his master, wrote William Goodell, a minister who chronicled the institution of slavery in the 1830s. What he chooses to inflict upon him, he must suffer. He must never lift a hand in self-defense. He must utter no word of remonstrance. He has no protection and no redress. Fewer than the animals of the field. They were seen as not capable of being injured, Goodell wrote. They may be punished at the discretion of their Lord, or even put to death by his authority. As a window into their exploitation, consider that in 1740, South Carolina, like other slave-holding states, finally decided to limit the workday of enslaved African Americans to 15 hours from March to September and to 14 hours from September to March, double the normal workday for humans who actually get paid for their labor. In that same era, prisoners found guilty of actual crimes were kept to the maximum of 10 hours per workday. Let no one say that African Americans as a group have not worked for our country. For the ceaseless exertions of their waking hours, many subsisted on a peck of corn a week, which they had to mill by hand at night after their labors in the field. Some owners denied them even that as a punishment and allowed meat for protein only once a year. They were scarcely permitted to pick up crumbs that fell from their masters' tables, George Whitefield wrote. Stealing food was a crime punished by flogging. Your slaves, I believe, work as hard, if not harder, than the horses whereon you ride, Whitefield wrote in an open letter to the colonies of the Chesapeake in 1739. These, after their work is done, are fed and taken proper care of. Enslavers bore down on their hostages to extract the most profit, whipping those who fell short of impossible targets, and whipping all the harder those who exceeded them to wring more from their exhausted bodies. Whipping was a gateway form of violence that led to bizarrely creative levels of sadism, wrote the historian Edward Baptist. Enslavers used every modern method of torture, he observed, from mutilation to waterboarding. Slavery made the enslavers among the richest people in the world, granting them the ability to turn a person into cash at the shortest possible notice. But from the time of enslavement, Southerners minimized the horrors they inflicted and to which they had grown accustomed. No one was willing, Baptist wrote, to admit that they lived in an economy whose bottom gear was torture. The vast majority of African Americans who lived in this land in the first 246 years of what is now the United States lived under the terror of people who had absolute power over their bodies and their every breath, subject to people who faced no sanction for any atrocity they could conjure. This fact is of great significance for the understanding of racial conflict, wrote the sociologist Guy B. Johnson, for it means that white people during the long period of slavery became accustomed to the idea of regulating Negro insolence and insubordination by force with the consent and approval of the law. Slavery so perverted the balance of power that it made the degradation of the subordinate caste seem normal and righteous. In the gentlest houses drifted now and then the sound of dragging chains and shackles, the bay of the hounds, the report of pistols on the trail of runway, wrote the Southern writer Wilbur Day Cash. And as the advertisements of the time incontestably prove, mutilation and the mark of the branding iron. The most respected and beneficent of society people oversaw forced labor camps that were politely called plantations, concentrated with hundreds of unprotected prisoners whose crime was that they were born with dark skin. Good and loving mothers and fathers, pillars of their communities, personally inflicted gruesome tortures upon their fellow human beings. For the horrors of the American Negro's life, wrote James Baldwin, there has been almost no language. This was what the United States was for longer than it was not. It is a measure of how long enslavement lasted in the United States that the year 2022 marks the first year that the United States will have been an independent nation for as long as slavery lasted on its soil. No current day adult will be alive in the year in which African Americans as a group will have been free for as long as they had been enslaved. That will not come until the year 2111. It would take a civil war, the deaths of 750,000 soldiers and civilians, the assassinations of a president, Abraham Lincoln, and the passage of the 13th Amendment to bring the institution of enslavement in the United States of America to an end. For a brief window of time, the 12 years known as Reconstruction, the North sought to rebuild the South and help the 4 million people who had been newly liberated. But the federal government withdrew the political expediency in 1877 and left those in the subordinate caste in the hands of the very people who had enslaved them. Now, nursing resentments from defeat in the war, people in the dominant caste took out their hostilities on the subordinate caste with fresh tortures and violence to restore their sovereignty in a reconstituted caste system. The dominant caste devised a labyrinth of laws to hold the newly freed people on the bottom rung ever more tightly, while a popular new pseudoscience called eugenics worked to justify the renewed debasement. People on the bottom rung could be beaten or killed with impunity for any breach of the caste system, like not stepping off the sidewalk fast enough or trying to vote. The colonists made decisions that created the caste system long before the arrival of the ancestors of the majority of people who now identify as Americans. The dominant caste controlled all resources, controlled whether, when, and if a Black person would eat, sleep, reproduce, or live. The colonists created a caste of people who would by definition be seen as dumb because it was illegal to teach them to read or write, as lazy to justify the bullwhip, as immoral to justify rape and forced breeding, as criminal because the colonists made the natural response to kidnap, floggings, and torture the human impulse to defend oneself or break free, a crime if one were black. Thus, each new immigrant, the ancestors of most current day Americans, walked into a pre existing hierarchy, bipolar in construction, arising from slavery and pitting the extremes in human pigmentation at opposite ends. Each new immigrant had to figure out how and where to position themselves in the hierarchy of their adopted new land. Oppressed people from around the world, particularly from Europe, passed through Ellis Island, shed their old selves and often their old names to gain admittance to the powerful dominant majority. Somewhere in the journey, Europeans became something that they had never been and needed to be before. They went from being Czech or Hungarian or Polish to white, a political designation that only has meaning when set against something not white. They would join a new creation, an umbrella category for anyone who entered the new world from Europe. Germans gained acceptance as part of the dominant caste in the 1840s. According to immigration and legal scholar Ian Haney Lopez, the Irish in the 1850s to 1880s, and the Eastern and Southern Europeans in the early 20th century. It was in becoming American that they became white. In Ireland or Italy, Lopez wrote, whatever social and racial identities these people might have possessed, being white wasn't one of them. Serbs and Albanians, Swedes and Russians, Turks and Bulgarians, who might have been at war with one another back in their mother countries, were fused together on the basis not of shared ethnic culture or language or faith or national origin, but solely on the basis of what they looked like in order to strengthen the dominant caste in the hierarchy. No one was white before he or she came to America, James Baldwin once said. Their geographic origin was their passport to the dominant caste. The European immigrants' experience was decisively shaped by their entering an arena where Europeanness, that is to say, whiteness, was among the most important possessions one could lay claim to, wrote the Yale historian Matthew Fry Jacobson. It was their whiteness, not any kind of New World magnanimity, that opened the golden door. To gain acceptance, each fresh infusion of immigrants had to enter into a silent, unspoken pact of separating and distancing themselves from the established lowest class caste. Becoming white meant defining themselves as furthest from its opposite, black. They could establish their new status by observing how the lowest caste was regarded and imitating or one upping the disdain and contempt, learning the epithets, joining in on violence against them to prove themselves worthy of admittance to the dominant caste. They might have arrived as neutral innocents, but would have been forced to choose sides if they were to survive in their adopted land. Here they had to learn how to be white. Thus, Irish immigrants who would not have had anything against any one group upon arrival, and were escaping famine and persecution of their own under the British, were pitted against black residents when they were drafted to fight a war over slavery from which they did not benefit and that they did not cause. Unable to attack the white elite who were sending them to war and who had prohibited black men from enlisting, Irish immigrants turned their frustration and rage against the scapegoats, who they by now knew were beneath them in the American hierarchy. They hung black men from lamp poles and burned to the ground anything associated with black people, homes, businesses, churches, a black orphanage in the draft riots of 1863, considered the largest race riot in American history. A century later, and in living memory, some 4,000 Italian and Polish immigrants went on a rampage when a Black veteran tried to move his family into the all-white suburb of Cicero, Illinois in 1951. Hostility toward the lowest caste became part of the initiation rite into the citizenship in America. Thus, people who had descended from Africans became the unifying foil in solidifying the caste system, the bar against which all others could measure themselves approvingly. It was not just that various white immigrant groups' economic successes came at the expense of non whites, Jacobson wrote, but that they owed their now stabilized and broadly recognized whiteness itself in part to those non white groups. The institution of slavery created a crippling distortion of human relationships, where people on one side were made to perform the role of subservience and to sublimate whatever innate talents or intelligence they might have had. They had to suppress their grief over the loss of children or spouses whose bodies had not died but in a way had died because they had been torn from them, never to be seen again, and at the hands of the very people they were forced to depend upon for their very breath. The reward for all this being that they might not be whipped that day, or their remaining son or daughter might not be taken from them this time. On the other side, the dominant caste lived under the illusion of an innate superiority over all other groups of humans, told themselves that the people they forced to work for up to 18 hours without the pay that anyone had a right to expect were not in fact people, but beasts of the field, childlike creatures, not men, not women, that the performances of servility that had been flogged out of them arose from genuine respect and admiration for their innate glory. These disfigured relationships were handed down through the generations. The people whose ancestors had put them atop the hierarchy grew accustomed to the unearned difference from the subjugated group and came to expect it. They told themselves that the people beneath them did not feel pain or heartache, were debased machines that only looked human, and upon whom one could inflict any atrocity. The people who told themselves these things were telling lies to themselves. Their lives were to some degree a lie, and in dehumanizing these people, whom they regarded as beasts of the field, they dehumanized themselves. Americans of today have inherited these distorted rules of engagement, whether or not their families had enslaved people or had even been in the United States. Slavery built the man-made chasm between blacks and whites that forces the middle caste of Asians, Latinos, indigenous people, and new immigrants of African descent to navigate within what began as a bipolar hierarchy. Newcomers learned to vie for the good favor of the dominant caste and to distance themselves from the bottom dwellers, as if everyone were in the grip of an invisible playwright. They learn to conform to the dictates of the ruling caste if they are to prosper in their new land. A shortcut being to contrast themselves with the degraded lowest caste, to use them as the historic foil against which to rise in a harsh, every man for himself economy. By the late 1930s, as war and authoritarianism were brewing in Europe, the caste system in America was fully in force and into its third century. Its operating principles were evident all over the country, but caste was enforced without order in the authoritarian Jim Crow regime of the former Confederacy. Caste in the South, wrote the anthropologists W. Lloyd Warner and Allison Davis, is a system for arbitrarily defining the status of all Negroes and of all whites with regard to the most fundamental privileges and opportunities of human society. It would become the social, economic, and psychological template at work in one degree or another for generations. A few years ago, a Nigerian-born playwright came to a walk that I gave at the British Library in London. She was intrigued by the lecture, the idea that 6 million African Americans had to seek political asylum within the borders of their own country during the Great Migration, a history that she had not known of. She talked with me afterward and said something that I had never forgotten. that startled me in its simplicity. You know that there are no black people in Africa, she said. Most Americans, weaned on the myth of drawable lines between human beings, have to sit with that statement. It sounds nonsensical to our ears. Of course, there are black people in Africa. There is a whole continent of black people in Africa. How could anyone not see that? Africans are not black, she said. They are Igbo and Yoruba and Iwe and Akan and Adebele. They are not black. They are just themselves. They are humans on the land. That is how they see themselves, and that is who they are. What we take as gospel in America, in American culture, is alien to them, she said. They don't become black until they go to America or come to the UK, she said. It is then that they become black. It was in the making of the New World that Europeans became white, Africans black, and everyone else yellow, red, or brown. It was in the making of the New World that humans were set apart on the basis of what they looked like, identified solely in contrast to one another, and ranked to form a caste system based on a new concept called race. It was in the process of ranking that we were all cast into assigned roles to meet the needs of the larger production. None of us are ourselves. My goodness, man. I'm reading this, you all, but it's breaking my heart because I'm reading these words as myself, but I'm envisioning what I'm reading. This is why it's so imperative to read the book, because the book will paint the picture for you. I know they did a movie, it's called Origins, based on this book, but the movie never, ever, 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 ever covers the details in its entirety as a book does. And I'm reading these words, and I'm hearing ancestors, and I'm kind of feeling through their experiences, and I'm seeing through their lenses and all of this stuff. And I'm like, my goodness, man, it's a lot. This is a lot. And even in what I'm seeing and reading and feeling, you all, it still doesn't remotely come close to what was actually experienced. This is the Disney version of what they actually experienced. They can write all day. People can write books all day and write what was going on during those times, a glossed over, combed over version. But it's the ones who lived it. It's, because the words that we're reading are horrifying. Horrifying. But that still has no bearings on what was actually experienced. And I know my elders, as recent as my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, the movie Sinners was filmed in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where my people are from. My grandmother, my mother, my aunts, my uncles. Set in the year 1932. 1932 is the year my grandmother was born. And guess what? Her father was a sharecropper, tobacco. Nice way of saying in the field. Okay? Her brother, that's just my grandmother and her father, which is my great grandfather. That is not long ago. Come on. I have a great great grandfather who is the descendant of, the seed of the enslaver who raped and enslaved, ancestor of mine. And of course, he's fair complected, taken after his father's skin, but also isolated and ostracized. Come on, man. This is not long ago. And so as I'm reading these words, I'm feeling my ancestors, and I'm seeing things, and I'm envisioning things, and I'm hearing things, and it's a lot. And it's like twofold, really. I'm feeling and sad, for them. But I'm so grateful because here I am in the year 2025, sitting here as a result of their endurance through this that I'm reading about. Isn't that crazy? I'm here, right here in this moment, filled with gratitude, filled with honor and love. And the people, religious or not, think that I'm not gonna call my grand's names and my foremothers and forefathers' names and venerate them. You have got to be out of your mind. I don't care what you call it. I don't care what you think about it. I'm honoring them. I'm going to constantly, forever, as long as I got breath in my body, call their names and honor them and venerate them because they deserve it. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I am here because of them. They endured this right here. They deserve to be called. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be venerated. They deserve it. They earned it. Just because of them, I am here. I will forever, ever, ever keep their name on my lips. Period. Chapter 5, entitled The Container We Have Built for You. Her name is Miss. It is only Miss. It is Miss for a reason. She was born in Texas in the 1970s to parents who came of age under Jim Crow, the authoritarian regime that laid the ground rules for the rest of a willing country. The overarching rule was that the lowest caste was to remain low in every way at all times at any cost. Every reference was intended to reinforce their inferiority. In describing a train wreck, for instance, newspapers would report 2 men and 2 women were killed and 4 Negroes. Black men were never to be addressed as Mr., and Black women were never to be addressed as Miss or Mrs., but rather by their first name or auntie or gal, regardless of their age or marital status. These rules were as basic as the change in the seasons, and a mayoral campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, turned almost entirely on a breach of a sacrosanct protocol. The supremacist police chief, Bull Connor, had a favorite in that 1961 race. 1961, you all. My mother was 1. This was not long ago. I need us to understand that and really keep that in the forefront of our mind. My father was 4. Come on, man. The supremacist, ooh, y'all. I'm feeling this in such a way, but I'm pushing through because my blood, this is my blood. This is the story of my blood. And as I'm reading, and even if you have your book, I need you to see your blood, feel your blood in these words. The supremacist police chief, Bull Connor, had a favorite in that 1961 race. He decided to secure the election of the man he wanted to win by framing the man he wanted to lose. He paid a Black man to shake the opposing candidate's hand in public as a photographer lay in wait. The story took up a full page in a local newspaper, and the opponent lost the election as Bull Connor knew he would. For white Southerners, it was a cardinal sin. It was harrowing, wrote the historian Jason Sokol, to call a Black man Mr. or to shake his hands. A young boy growling up 90 miles south in Selma watched white people, complete strangers, children even, call his mother and grandmother by their first names, have the nerve to call out Pearlie to his mother instead of Mrs. Hale, despite their upright bearing and church gloves and finery. Harold Hale came to hate this presumption of overfamiliarity. They're putting his high-minded mama and big mama in their place, and worse still, knowing that there was nothing he could do about it. In early 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to town. It had been 100 years since the end of the Civil War, and the subordinate caste was still not permitted to vote, despite the 15th Amendment granted that right. Harold Hale signed up for the march Dr. King was planning from Selma to Montgomery. The Edmund Pettus Bridge that they would have to cross to begin the journey was a few blocks from Hale's house. When he and the 600 other marchers arrived at the foot of the bridge, a column of state troopers in helmets and on horseback blocked their path. The troopers stormed the protesters. They gassed, beat, and trampled them, charging horses, their hooves flashing over the fallen. In the words of the writer George B. Leonard, who wrote in horror from his black and white television set, who watched in horror from his black and white television set. ABC News had cut into the middle of the judgment at Nuremberg, a movie about Nazi war crimes, to broadcast the grainy footage from Selma, one nightmare fusing into another. Hale, a teenager far from the leaders up front, was unharmed physically, but he worried now about how long it might take for change to come. He decided then and there that if there was one thing he would do, he would make the dominant caste respect the next generation in his line. He decided he would stand up to the caste system by naming his firstborn daughter, whenever he might be so blessed, Miss. He would give no one in the dominant caste the option but to call her by the title they had denied his foremothers. Miss would be her name. When his firstborn daughter arrived, his wife Linda went along with the plan. Miss was now seated across from me at her lace-covered dinner table one summer evening. The homemade lasagna and strawberry cake had been put away. The kids and her husband were otherwise occupied, and she was recounting her life, north and south, how her father's dreams have brushed up against caste as she moves about the world. A white porcelain sugar bowl sat between us on the table. She swept her hand over the top of the bowl. I find that white people are fine with me, she said, as long as I stay in my place, as long as I stay in the container we have built for you. She tapped the side of the sugar bowl, gentle, insistent taps. As soon as I get out of the container, she said, lifting the lid from its bowl, it's a problem. She held the lid up to the light and then closed it back in its place. When she was a little girl, her family moved to a small town in East Texas. They were the only black family on their block. Her father took delight in keeping its front yard pristine and tended to it in his off hours. He would change out the annuals in the flower beds overnight so that the people would awaken to the surprise of practically a new yard. One day, a white man who lived in the neighborhood saw her father out front mowing the lawn. The man told her father he was doing a mighty fine job and asked what he was charging for yard work. Oh, I don't charge anything, Harold Hale said. I get to sleep with the lady of the house. He smiled at the man. I live here. Once word got out, people took baseball bats and knocked down the mailbox in front of the Hale's carefully tended garden. So Harold Hale set the next mailbox in concrete. One day, someone rolled by and tried to knock it down again from the car window. And when they did, the family heard a yell from outside. The person had hurt their arm trying to hurl the bat at the new mailbox, Miss said. But it was in concrete, and the bat kicked back at him. People left the mailbox alone after that. The local high schools began permitting the two castes to go to school together in the early 1970s, before the family had arrived. When she was in 10th grade, she and her friends attracted unexpected attention for the walkie-talkies they used during their breaks between classes. This was before cell phones, and it allowed her to keep in touch with her friends, who'd gather at her locker at break time. The principal called her into the office one day, suspicious and of the activity, and wanted to know why these people were gathered around her locker. She showed him the device. He asked her name. Miss Hale, she said. What's your first name? It's Miss. I said, what is your first name? My name is Miss. I don't have time for this foolishness. What's your real name? She repeated the name her father had given her. The principal was agitated now and told an assistant to get her records. The records confirmed her name. Hail, hail, he repeated to himself, trying to figure out the origins of this breach in protocol. In small southern towns, the white people knew or expected to know all the black people, the majority of whom would be dependent on the dominant caste for their income or survival one way or another. He was trying to figure out what black family had had the nerve to name their daughter Miss, knowing the fix it would put the white people in. Hale, I don't know any Hales, he finally said. You're not from around here. Where's your father from? He's from Alabama. Who does he work for? She told him the name of the company, which was based outside of Texas. She told him it was a Fortune 500 company. Her parents had taught her to say this in hopes of giving her some extra protection. I knew you weren't from around here, he said. Know how I know? She shook her head, waiting to be excused. You looked me in the eye when I was talking, he said of the breach in Caste. Colored folks from around here know better than to do that. She was finally excused, and when she got home that day, she told her father what happened. He had waited 20 years for this moment. What did he say? And then what did you say? And what did he say after that? He could barely contain himself. The plan was working. He told her over and over that she must live up to the name she was given. They don't have the corner on humanity, he told her. They don't have the corner on femininity. They don't have the corner on everything it means to be a whole, admirable, noble, honorable female member of the species. They haven't cornered that. Years later, Miss had a chance to see life in another part of America. In college, she was invited to spend the summer with the family of the fellow student on Long Island in New York. The family welcomed her and got a kick out of her name and how her family had stuck it to those bigots down south. She was attentive to the grandmother in the family, so the grandmother grew especially fond of her. Miss had a grateful, easygoing manner and was respectful toward the elders in the long tradition of black Southern life. When the summer came to a close, it was time to return to school. The grandmother was despondent at her leaving, so attached she had grown to her. I wish you could stay, the matriarch said, looking forlorn and hoping to convince her still. Miss reminded her that she would need to be leaving. There was time, the matriarch said in warning and regret, when I could have made you stay. There was a time. She adjusted herself, her voice trailing off at her impotence. She said, there was a time I could have made you stay. To even say that says that still resonates. There's still residue in her heart to be this way. Each of us is in a container of some kind. The label signals to the world what is presumed to be inside and what is to be done with it. The label tells you which shelf your container supposedly belongs on. In a caste system, the label is frequently out of sync with the contents, mistakenly put on the wrong shelf, and this hurts people and institutions in ways we may not always know. Back before Amazon and iPhones, I was a national correspondent at the New York Times, based in Chicago. I decided to do a lighthearted piece about Chicago's Magnificent Mile, a prime stretch of Michigan Avenue that had always been the city's showcase, but now some big names some big names, from New York and elsewhere were about to take up residence. I figured New York retailers would be delighted to talk. As I planned the story, I reached out to them for interviews. Everyone I called was thrilled to describe their foray into Chicago and to sit down with the Times. The interviews went as expected until the last one. I had arrived a few minutes early to make sure we could start on time, given the deadline I was facing. The boutique was empty at this quiet hour of the late afternoon. The manager's assistant told me the manager would be arriving soon from another appointment. I told her I didn't mind to wait. I was happy to get another big name in the piece. She went to a back corner as I stood alone in the wide open showroom. A man in a business suit and overcoat walked in, harried and breathless. From the far corner, she nodded that this was him. So I went up to introduce myself and get started. He was out of breath, had been rushing, coat still on, checking his watch. Oh, I can't talk with you now, he said, brushing past me. I'm very, very busy. I'm running late for an appointment. I was confused at first. Might he have made another appointment for the exact same time? Why would he schedule 2 appointments at once? There was no one else in the boutique but the two of us and his assistant in back. I think I'm your appointment, I said. No, this is a very important appointment with the New York Times, he said, pulling off his coat. I can't talk with you now. I'll have to talk with you some other time. But I am with the New York Times, I told him, pen and notebook in hand. I talked with you on the phone. I'm the one who made the appointment with you for 4:30. What's the name? Isabel Wilkerson with New York Times. How do I know that? He shot back, growing impatient. Look, I said I don't have time to talk with you right now. She'll be here any minute. He looked to the front entrance and again at his watch. But I am Isabel. We should be having the interview right now. He let out a sigh. What kind of identification do you have? Do you have a business card? This was the last interview for the piece, and I had handed them all out by the time I got to him. I've been interviewing all day, I told him. I happen to be out of them now. What about ID? Do you have a license on you? I shouldn't have to show you my license, but here it is. He gave me a cursory look. You don't have anything that has the New York Times on it? Why would I be here if I weren't here to interview you? All of this time has passed. We've been standing here and no one else has shown up. She must be running late. I'm going to have to ask you to leave so I can get ready for my appointment. I left and walked back to the Times girl, dazed and incensed, trying to figure out what had just happened. This was the first time I had ever been accused of impersonating myself. His caste notions of who should be doing what in society had so blinded him that he dismissed the idea that the reporter he was anxiously waiting for, excited to talk to, was standing right in front of him. It seemed not to occur to him that a New York Times national correspondent could come in a container such as mine, despite every indication that I was she. The story ran that Sunday. Because I had not been able to interview him, he didn't get a mention. It would have amounted to a nice bit of publicity for him, but the other interviews made it unnecessary in the end. I sent him a clip of the piece along with the business card that he asked for. To this day, I won't step inside that retailer. I will not mention the name, not because of censorship or desire to protect any company's reputation, but because of our cultural tendency to believe that if we just identify the presumed to be rare offending outlier, we will have rooted out the problem. The problem could have happened any place because the problem is, in fact, at the root. Wow, he possibly missed out on the greatest opportunity and marketing opportunity for his business. But because of his own racism, his own limitations, oh, he missed it. Well, that's what happens because here's the thing. With every decision that we make, with every choice, and that goes for all of us, with every decision, there is a karmic path right on the other side of that. So, unfortunately, his choice to do what he did, to be rude, to not believe her, to shush her and dismiss her, and not take her seriously, or even think that a black woman, would be qualified for as a correspondent or a journalist at the New York Times. His karmic path was to not receive the abundance that was right there, readily available for him. We read a book a couple years ago collectively called The Mountain Is You. In that moment, the mountain was him. He was his own block. Interesting. Alrighty, you all. On Tuesday, we will continue with chapter 6. It's called The Measure of Humanity. The Measure of Humanity. This is something. This is something. Hello, Celeste. Welcome, my love. Welcome to anyone who's here. Whether on any platform you're listening from. This whole thing has just been, and everything is so timely, it really, really is, because I'm reading this book now. I actually had something else scheduled to read during this time, but I was led to read this first and then continue with the next book. Um, it's timely because of the climate that we're in right now. The climate that we've been in. But it's been very, very, very prevalent since the 2016 election. It was prevalent when Obama was elected in 08, by the outrage of the people who did not want him in that seat. And then the re-election of him right after, back to back. But when he had to give up the seat to Trump the first time, it was insane how insolent and the vitriol that it was insane. I was in utter disbelief. And then you had things like the riots and the picketing and the protests and the insurrections, and it was a lot, and it's even greater now. It's even deepening now. Now that he's back in office, and it's like an attack on minority, and it's a lot going on right now, and it's time for us to really, 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 like I said, really understand the magnitude of this and where we stand, how to stand rather, and not to back down, not to retreat, not at all, absolutely not. We will not. I will not. My life is worth it. Your life is worth it. Just like our ancestors, our lives were worth it, so they endured long enough. Our future generations' lives are worth it. And so I will endure. You will endure. We will endure together. All right? Alrighty, for those who don't have the book and you would like to have this book, please, please, please reach out to me, okay? This is a free copy of the book that we're reading, all right? Inbox me or email me with your information. You can email me at info@biancamissblee.com. Again, info@biancamissblee.com. Please visit my website to see more about when we are coming together, how you can interact with us and engage with us, how you can, follow the astrological transits. I am an astrologer. You can also take advantage of some of my services that I have to offer, books, merchandise, all of those things is over there, okay? That is biancamissblee.com. Follow me on social media, you all, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Clubhouse, all at Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee. Again, that is Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee, okay? Alrighty, you all, listen, that concludes today's session. This is something, man. This is really something that we have to slow walk through because it's very overwhelming. It's very overwhelming. It can really, really, really be triggering. But we got to slow pace. We got to take it, a portion at a time and really, 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 see it for what it is. Feel it however we need to feel it. And go from there, okay? Alrighty, you all, listen, like always, I love you. I mean it. There is absolutely positively nothing you can do about it. Don't you even try it. We'll be back here on Tuesday evening, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on the Voices of Empowerment with Dr. B. Peace.